Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gillian McIntyre, and I'm an interpretive planner at the Art Gallery of Ontario. We come to you from the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation. It was also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the New Credit Anishinaabe Nation. And I am very thankful to live on this land, which is quite far from England, where I grew up. We're going to talk today about looking at early art from the European art from the 1600s through the lens of social justice. We were charged in 2017, I was working on it as an interpretive planner, to reinstall the European galleries. And I soon realized that in the 21st century, we should do something to look at where the wealth had come from behind all this marvelous Dutch and Netherlandish painting, that we had to out the history. I was actually talking to my husband about what I was working on, and he pulled up his newspaper and I said, "Are you not interested?" He said, "Why should I be interested in a violent, racist history?" I have to say my husband is a Black Trinidadian. We have 3 children who I have adult children who I have watched navigate through being mixed heritage in this country. And so this will be our topic today. And I am joined today by Jason Cyrus, who has just finished his master's degree at York University in art history and curatorial affairs, and worked with me in 2017 as an intern. So Jason, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Jillian, for having me chat with you today. Our time together was, I do have to say, quite seriously life-changing. It was wonderful to be able to work with you and to use different lenses to understand the history behind a lot of the art that we see and that I've studied for so long. I now use art history and fashion as lenses into my own work and research to pull out and tease out histories and narratives relating to marginalized people groups. And I believe that that really is a way that we can make lasting change and decolonize a lot of histories and narratives that no longer hold weight in our modern world.
Thank you, Jason. So it was an interesting challenge because to look at that art, and of course 1600s was a time the wealth came from slavery. Yeah. And how do you talk about that without at the same time demonizing the marvelous art of Rembrandt and Frans Hals, etc.? The AGO in the past has been criticized heavily for having a collection which was started at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is mainly the taste of the people of that time. And it was a lot of dead, white, male, old art from Europe. And recently, in recent years, we've made huge strides in diversifying. But of course, that's much easier to do in the collection in our contemporary galleries and so on. So not only, you know, more women and diverse people from all over the place. We wish to reflect the city that we are working in. So one of the jobs as an interpretive planner is to put strategies to engage people, to make the work accessible, to make it relative to contemporary lives. Why should you care about this painting? Why should you look at this painting? And of course, one of our jobs is to work with a curator who's the content expert, but you have to write copy and you have to think, well, what else can we do? I mean, the big ambition is to get people to look at the art. There is no one finite meeting in any art. Meaning. And you want people to stand there and interpret from their own perspective, as well as, so you tell them some things that we know. And So if we could have the slide of the newly installed, it's called the E.R. Wood Gallery, which was the art from the 1600s. Right, so here you see, I have to say that before reinstallation, that gallery, we did a lot of visitor studying. We do a lot of visitor studying at the AGO. So before we reinstalled it, I spent a lot of time in this gallery trying to assess what people were doing. Were they stopping? Were they looking? Were they talking to one another? Were they reading labels? What was going on? And basically it was a bit of a passageway, as were the other European galleries. And I can understand why people just wouldn't necessarily, not all people, but connect with this art. So if we start looking at one of the paintings, and this is a very pertinent painting to today. So what I love about my work and about interpretation is that you can mine art. It's infinite. You can start mining the art and drawing out of it what you can. So this was a painting done in 1637 by an artist in Antwerp called Hendrik Andriessen, who was Catholic. And it's called a Vanitas. It's a still life. Now, in the Netherlands at this time, still lifes became very, very popular. And a lot of people, there was a new middle class, everybody wanted art. The cobbler, the blacksmith, the fishmonger, and so on. People wanted art on their walls. So this would have been made for a domestic interior. And it's called a Vanitas because it's the vanity of thinking that our life on earth is anything other than transient. So the skull represents death, and the laurel wreath around it says, death will win. Now, interestingly, at the time this was painted, they too were experiencing plague as we are now. I worked on a Rubens show last year and his wife died of the plague. So I understand now how, they actually left Antwerp, went to Brussels to try and avoid the plague, came back to Antwerp and got it anyway. So what you have in this painting is all sorts of symbols and clues about the time that it was painted. So there are some things in there that refer to time. For example, the rope is burning, if you can see that to the right of the skull. When that fire, that burning comes to the end, your time is up. There is also a clock. There is also a lamp. The funny shaped thing is a lamp. So when the lamp oil is burned out, that's it. When the clock is done, that's it. But at the same time, there are things in there to talk to you about the earthly pleasures. A lute, you can see the back of a lute in the background. You can see silk, you can see tobacco. The books, I believe, when you're reading about these things, you have different interpretations of it. I think it may be just the futility of intellectual pursuits. It's on top of a book. Amusingly, what he's written on that piece of paper is don't forget to pay the bill. So Jason did a lot of research, went down many, many, many rabbit holes, and analyzing this painting, which quite frankly, you could probably do a PhD just on what you can find in this painting. So Jason, would you like to talk to us about some of the things you discovered?
Of course. I think a key part that you're mentioning here is that there are different ways of seeing the art. And as you've so rightly said, on one hand, it is this very pertinent reminder about the transience of life, its fleeting nature, that we are not here permanently on the earth. And therefore, the very other side of the coin is, therefore, then live now, enjoy life now, engage in sensual pleasures. You're pointing out the sumptuousness of the silk, and you can hear the lute coming from the music, and reading and sight. All these ways are engaging you, but what you've also got are luxury objects. I mean, the painting itself is a luxury object. It would have been a commission. And the pieces you are seeing, very carefully curated in this Vanitas, are all ways of displaying wealth. And of course, you cannot think of wealth during the 1600s without thinking about where the wealth comes from. And which is exactly what we wanted to share in our work together in the reinstallation, is that to look at wealth in the 1600s, specifically in Europe, you have to make connections to trade and you have to make connections to slavery. So, for example, if you look at the silk, that beautiful pale blue watery silk that's in the painting, that's hailing from China. It's hailing from the East. Trade routes that the Dutch would have created along the coast to bring that silk back. You are looking at the bill made of paper, of course, and that, of course, is coming from China. But it's also connecting us now to our own modern ways of thinking, because the Dutch used paper in the first stock market. So here in this painting, in a sense, you're seeing connections to Bay Street. What I find really interesting is the tobacco that you see in that small piece of paper on the ledge. And tobacco would have been grown in the Americas. It would have been grown using the labor of enslaved Africans. So while you're seeing the sensual pleasures of enjoying the tobacco and feeling the silk, and you cannot remove these luxuries from the atrocities of slavery and also the hardships of trade that were created in bringing these goods back to Europe.
Yeah, so it's interesting as a Catholic, Hendrik Anderson would absolutely have had a firm belief in, you know, the transience of life, and that if you believed in Jesus and in Christianity, that you would have, you know, eternity in heaven. I have to say, I've always loved this painting. I've always been drawn to this painting, and I happen to like the specials, you know, a scar group from England, and you know, I always think, enjoy yourself while you're in the pink when I look at this painting.
Yes. Yes.
So I think we could move on to another painting in this gallery. So first of all, we're looking at the installation shot. By the way, look at the color of those walls. It was one of the things we wanted to do, just to give a shot of life into the galleries. So this, and then you can see the wonderful turquoisey blue in the next one. And Jason and I actually had great fun walking around the galleries with the curator, Sasha Suda, and picking colors and even engaging with visitors and saying, what do you think about this? Were you going to say something, Jason?
And I believe the name of this, the name of the color is Hague Blue, which of course tying into that Flemish Dutch history that obviously we were trying to so far to tease out in
Yes.
the work we were doing. But I just love that contemporary connection there.
By the way, the chairs, that was an early installation photo in 2017, were replaced with marvelous, huge leather furniture that you can come and lounge on. And I mean, one of the things we want people to do at the gallery is to stay a while and to look. And if they're using it for social reasons, that's just fine. We want it to be a community center. Yeah. So the painting we're going to talk about next is on the right-hand side. So perhaps if we could look at a full screen image of that painting. It's another Catholic artist from Antwerp called Artus Walford. And he actually worked in the studio of Otto von Wien, who was one of Rubens' instructors. And he did he did some church commissions, but he also did a lot of paintings, religious paintings for private families. So, and I have to confess that actually art really needs to be looked at. You need to spend time in front of it, engage with it, think about it, see how you feel. This particular painting is one that prior to our working on it, I would have just walked past. It just never drew me. And now I love it because it's so full of meaning. So it's Christ at the pool of Bethesda. And Bethesda was a healing pool near Sheep's Gate in Jerusalem. And I think there were several pools there. And people believed that it had healing powers and that there's an angel above the water. So when the angel's got its hand, when it troubled the water, stirred up the water, the first person into the water would be healed. So people gathered every day with all sorts of, disabilities, blindness, paralysis, all kinds of sicknesses you can only imagine. And what we're looking at here is a man in the front who was paralyzed, and he had been going, his family had been bringing him to this pool for 38 years. But there was no way he could get up and get into the water ahead of other people. And Jesus noticed him, and he's there. And the man explained to Jesus that he just couldn't get into the water to get healed. And Jesus said, "Take up your bed and walk," and healed the man there and then. It later got Jesus into trouble because this man ended up reporting him for having done work on the Sabbath. So that's a whole other story. But there's so much. And by the way, you can see it's a Baroque painting. You can see elements of the sort of the drama, the movement, the diagonals. It's got that wonderful Baroque that Rubens, of course, was such a master at. But Jason, you had some wonderful observations of this painting.
Yes, and as I'm just going to continue your point on the beautiful Baroque elements, because what Walford is showing in this specific moment is, of course, the climax. Not only is Jesus healing the man, and we see that in the foreground, but in the background, you see the angel on a diagonal coming to trouble the water. And if you look at the faces of everyone, you can, in a sense, see their wonder, their awe, their anticipation, perhaps their frustration, knowing that a stampede is actually just about to happen. And yet you look at the disciples, Jesus's group of men that are just behind him, you can see, in a sense, their own disbelief, their own wonder. It's a painting that really does encourage further looking. But I will be very honest with you, I had a very hard time finding a way into this painting. While I do come from a Judeo-Christian background, and I know this story is very well known in the book of John in the Christian Bible, I struggled to find a contemporary way of finding its relevance to my own life. And I remember chatting with a very good friend of mine who is differently able, and he was talking about how hard it is for him to come to art galleries because he rarely saw himself reflected in the art. And I think through our conversations, I realized that one of the first ways that this painting really is quite meaningful is that it's about access. As you mentioned, this man has been coming to these pools for 38 years, or at least the biblical story mentions that he's been disabled for 38 years, and he's been coming probably for around that amount of time. And the reason why he's been coming so much is that, as you said, when the angel troubles the water, and again, we can see the angel coming down right behind him, everyone rushes forward. And because of his physical condition, there are barriers to his access. So while we can obviously think of the supernatural and the fantastical moment of everyone rushing into the water, you think, well, who also is not allowed, or who does not have access based on the barriers that are there? And it's such a reflection too of our contemporary times. And I think it's very important to point out that while this is a story that has been told from the beginning of time through the Christian faith, the way of seeing disability as something that needs to be healed, something that is a negative, holds absolutely no water in our contemporary way and our contemporary understanding of being. But it does make us think, what barriers of access still exist? What barriers do we have still very much entrenched in our society that privilege certain ways of being? Now, a beautiful thing about this painting, in addition to really making us critically think about access, is that it's also about belief in the supernatural. It's about belief and perseverance that you can transcend your present experience, that there is something force, a power that is beyond your being that you can believe in. And of course, that lesson is prevalent across many faith traditions, across many technologies of being that we can list from now until tomorrow. And what Jesus actually, as you said, is in a sense touching upon is a man's deep, steadfast faith that someday he too can receive his healing. And in a sense, it's that faith, it's that steadfastness that really, I think, helped me to understand, which was for me the most personal and profound meaning of this painting, which had to do with the song Wade in the Water, which of course is a spiritual being, a song, a limerick, a hymn, so to speak, that Black Americans and Black Canadians would sing together as a way of reenacting culture, as a way of encouraging their faith, and as a way too of being safe. Because the song Wade in the Water speaks to exactly the moment that Walford is saying here. The lyrics talk about troubling the water, the angel coming along, but also another story that is also very important to the Judeo-Christian faith, which is of course the Israelites leaving Egypt and crossing over the Red Sea. And we know that story, of course, from not just the faith, but we've got movies like The Prince of Egypt, and this whole notion of escaping hardship and being free is also very prevalent in many other traditions. But what's wonderful about that song is that that was used as a way of encouraging the faith of enslaved Africans in the States and in Canada to believe that they too can transcend the horrors of slavery, that there was a higher power and a force that would deliver them, but also that their sense of community, their inner strength, their dignity was worth validating, and that they were not their present surroundings. What's interesting too about the song is that it was used also as a way of being safe, because the song Wade in the Water was sung together, not just as this way of enacting faith and encouragement, but as a very smart way of telling each other, stay along the water's edge on the Underground Railroad into Canada, because your scent would be carried by the water. So when the bloodhounds and the other methods that the plantation owners and bounty hunters used to recapture the slaves as they were trying to free themselves, staying by the water would be an additional way of being safe. And of course, the recent film Harriet, that was played by Cynthia Erivo, a fellow Brit, as yourself, really touched on this point and brought that to popular culture. And I think this is where I really started to see my own history, because I'm Guyanese Canadian. I came to this country halfway through my life. And of course, my own background, there are many people who came to Guyana through different modes of being, whether it was through slavery, through indentured laborship. But I have family in Maryland. And Maryland, of course, was a key part of the Underground Railroad. These routes and stopping points between the plantations in the southern states to Canada, where a lot of refugee Americans of course, an African background, where we're trying to find freedom.
Thank you, Jason. That was, I mean, it's so wonderful what I watched, you know, as you dug into this painting, and it evolved and it evolved and it evolved. And of course, we put reference to wade into the water on the label. And I think you and I have both, I certainly have seen people photographing that label and then sitting on the bench and looking at the painting, which is very gratifying. And didn't you tell me when you were doing some visitor studying of our new labels to see if they were working, you saw a young girl?
Yes, I have to say, I'm going to get a little bit emotional because it was probably one of the most profound moments of my life. As you were saying before, the gallery was, in a sense, a hallway, a through point between one room to the next. And we really wanted to make the room a place where you could stop, spend time with art, but most importantly, see yourself reflected. And I sat in the galleries, visitor testing, looking at the way that visitors were coming through. And there was a young girl. She could not have been older than probably 12. She walked by the painting, looked at it, but then she stopped and she went back to look at the label. And she started reading it. And I could have seen her stop at the moment that we mentioned Wade in the Water, because it was just around the end of that label. And I saw her take her phone out, take a picture as if to capture it for posterity, or maybe to show a mother or an auntie or a father, you know, this connection to a song that she probably would know just based on cultural tradition. And then she moved on. And then I remember thinking how wonderful that we can see ourselves reflected. And to me, as you were sharing the land acknowledgement at the very beginning, I remember thinking, in a sense, these acknowledgements can seem so removed from our daily existence. And they have become rote in many ways where we just, you know, we recite them. But in a sense, that is the very essence of what we're trying to do here. To me, it's of this whole notion of placing marginalized identities at the center and telling histories and being allies with indigenous cultures. And I remember you sharing that your own daughter had, in a sense, maybe a polar opposite experience.
Yes, she's now an adult and an artist herself, and a lot of her art is actually Anna Jane McIntyre is about identity. But she came to the AGO on a school trip, and she came home and mentioned to me that all of the art and the people she saw were white. She actually noticed. She was quite young. You know, and it was part of these reasons why I went into the work I went into. How can we, I did my master's research paper at U of T on a relationship between so-called minority communities and the AGO. And everybody said at that point, which by the way is 1996, we have moved on, is it a very short paper? So, and I love the connection of this painting to the Underground Railroad. And I live in Oakville, which was one of the ends of the Underground Railroad. So Jason, I really want to thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for the pleasure we had in mining this collection. And we could talk about 5 more paintings because
Yes.
there's more that we did. But we would like to end with looking at a video of a local performer, Dion Taylor, with Lou Pimenti. And it's a video put out by Riddle Films, performing Wade into the Water. And I'm getting emotional even just thinking about it. So thank you, Jason.
My pleasure, Julian. Thank you.
Dressed in red, God's gonna trouble the children that Moses led. Oh, it's gonna trouble the water. I said, wait in the water, children, wait in the water. Don't you wait in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. See those children, yeah, dressed in white, yeah. God's gonna trouble the water. Said it must be the children of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. I said away in the water, yeah. Wait in the water, children. Wait in the water, yeah. God's gonna trouble the water. Why don't you wait in the water? Ooh, wait in the water, children. Wait in the water, yeah. God's gonna trouble the water. I said that He's gonna trouble the water. You know God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Ooh.
Oh, oh, wow.